So the war in Ukraine has been going on for close to a year now. We're coming up on the anniversary. And I started a series of presentations, the economic front, back then, because I said, oh, we're going to have this economic conflict. It's going to be really interesting. And honestly, as it's gone along, the data hasn't been there. It's been kind of confusing. All right, lots of news about sanctions being put on, but what's really been happening? And so honestly, as this war has progressed, I've pretty much had better information about what's going on in the front lines. I understand better what's going on in Bakhmut than I do necessarily with the sanctioning. So a year on, let's look at the latest reporting and see what is happening with the sanctioning. So have sanctions been effective? And I always say, look, there are different types of effectiveness, right? First, there's economic impact. And that seems to be what people talk about a lot. Are the sanctions hurting? Are the sanctions biting? But there's also the political effect, or efficacy, as it's called by Mulder, the author of Economic Weapon. And that's that question of, it's one thing, okay, you have the sanction, it has an economic impact. You had a point, right? You had a purpose, a goal with this. What has been the political effect? And I think we can say unambiguously, if the goal has been to get Putin to stop, right, to sue for peace, we could say, well, we haven't seen that effect yet. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be focused on economic impact. But as I've looked at this, there's another impact or effect that might be important. And we could argue about whether we should call it an impact or an effect, but the military effect. This is a war. The sanctions might not be about coercion, trying to get Putin to change his behavior. They might be, and sometimes are expressed as an attempt to limit Russia's ability to conduct the war and to be a threat to the world. Lots of EU statements along those lines. And so there's that question of military effect, right? And again, this is a bit hard to gauge because people aren't talking about it. It comes up anecdotally that, we're keeping imports certainly imports of weapons. Russia can't buy weapons without people being sanctioned, so that's there. But the idea that technology transfers are down, that has been anecdotally discussed. Not going to really talk too much about it here. Going to mainly be focusing on what that economic impact in the first place is, because that is the first step to these other things. But I will say this about the political impact. If the sanctions haven't had a political impact on Russia yet, they also haven't had one on the EU and the US. We have seen no weakening of resolve, right, on the part of the allies. Now, maybe it will come, but really, as this winter has been, temperate, we haven't seen the EU burning through its stockpile of natural gas. We haven't seen people shivering. We've seen it in Ukraine, but through military means. But we haven't seen a cold winter in Europe, although natural gas prices, definitely skyrocketed in Europe. So even though I'm going to focus mostly on Russia here, we can say, look, Putin might have hoped that his relationship with Europe would cause them to moderate and, weaken them, split the coalition. That has not happened. Okay, let's just look at some things. Reuters has had an article. They're kind of saying, hey, look, your attempt to bankrupt Russia could backfire in a number of ways. And they point at, the idea that, and they're kind of thinking sanctions are doing more harm than good. Not too much of an argument there. It's just a news organization, but they did have a couple of factoids here. First, especially in the form of graphics, here we have the impact on the Russian ruble. And this is rubles per dollar. So when that line goes up, it takes more rubles to buy a dollar. So from Russia's point of view, going up bad, going down means your currency is strong. And after an initial spike, it looks like, the ruble has stabilized below the pre-war levels. So it's actually stronger than it was originally. And so this is the graph that's the most damning for sanctions, or kind of supports the argument that, oh, sanctions haven't been having an effect. Now, when we look at this, it's important to remember that Russia has been propping up its currency. It's taken a lot of measures to do that. It's used a lot of its foreign exchange to buy rubles, right? And to keep the system going. They've also tried to say, hey, we're going to sell gas. You have to pay for our exports in rubles. They've tried to get along that from some people. And so they've really been propping this up. And the question is, how long can it continue? How much foreign exchange do they have? Now, the Reuters article says, hey, they've got plenty. They can start selling things like gold. They've got other assets. They can keep this up. But it is finite. However, and so at some point it can run out. But at this point, that running out doesn't seem to be imminent. Then there's the impact on oil prices. And what we see here is the difference between the Brent, which is, the European exchange for gas. There's Brent and West Texas. But then there's also the Urals oil, right? And that is trading generally below Brent crude, right? So if Brent crude's the normal international price that Russia might have otherwise expected to get for its oil, what we see is that they're selling around $20. It got down to 30, and it is down to 30 again, but 20 to 30 below the Brent crude. Now, this is exactly what models of sanctioning say will happen. If you put sanctions on the exports from a country, then what you're going to do is basically create two types of, so there's two types of oil. There's the type of oil from Russia and the oil from everywhere else. And the sanctions, if they have an effect, right, if that volume of trade is big enough, it will result in a lowering of the price of the sanctioned product, the sanctioned exports. And that's exactly what the model predicts. But the model also says, hey, what's going to happen is, the sanctioned party is going to sell to third parties, to non-sanctioning, the rest of the world, or ROW, as I like to call it. And those guys are going to get some nice, cheap exports, in this case, oil. But the point is that lowering the price is what we expect when sanctions are having an economic impact. And it does look like, that has happened, and it's actually looks persistent. It isn't a case of, oh, the sanctions came in and everyone just had to rearrange their trade relationships there. And so maybe for a short time there was an impact, but in the long run, people just find new trading patterns and it goes back to normal, right? That we just shuffle the deck and there's no impact. That happens a lot with sanctioning. Clearly not happening here with oil, which is the most mobile of things, right? This is the one where you would expect that to happen. Natural gas, and I don't have prices data here for that, but natural gas goes through pipes. It's harder to divert, and there you've seen bigger changes in the market. So we do see an impact on oil prices. Now, the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, you might be like, what the heck do they have to do with this? They released a report, and so probably some of the best data that has recently come out comes from them. And they find that, their headline is their bottom line. The EU ban and price cap are costing Russia 160 million euros a day. And they think that, hey, if you take further measures, you can multiply that effect, right? So they see this ban and price cap, right? And the EU has finally put a price cap on oil and trading of oil that if you are above, and I believe the price cap, sometimes it's 60, and I believe they're down to $45 per barrel. And they're like, we're not going to pay more for Russian oil than that. And they also are putting out secondary sanctions, or trying to get them on, like, hey, if you can't issue insurance to a oil tanker carrying Russian oil unless it's in compliance with this cap. So this cap is the new thing, and there's a lot of questions about whether that's actually going to work. And so that's a whole separate topic. Their argument, though, is that we are seeing an impact, right? So Korea here, just to take their points, pull points out, they found that Russian earnings from fossil fuels fell 17% last December, the 22nd. This is very important because, in the middle of last year, imports were down, but because the price of oil had gone so high, I don't know if you remember, I remember paying $5 a gallon for gas last summer. The point was that even though the Russians were selling oil at a discount to other nations, the price was so high compared to prior to the war that their revenues didn't go down. With the price of oil decreasing, that appears to no longer be the case. This is a huge point, right? And 17%. That's 70%. I mean, it's not nothing, but it's not a collapse, right? But we are seeing finally some revenues going down. They noticed, talking about the effect of the rest of the world, right, and the ability to evade sanctions or to replace the sanctioned trade with non-sanctioning nations, they found that the EU, that Russia rather, was able to claw back 20 million euros per day, right? So they said, look, they probably lost 180 million in trade with the sanctioning nations, but trade with other people replaced 20 million, right? So instead of it being 180 million lost per day, it's 160. And so the rest of the world comes in, but they are supplementing their income, but they're not completely replacing it. That's interesting. Another fact, a little factoid, their estimate is that Russia is currently making 640 million euros a day from fossil fuels, right? Which is going to, and they argue that the EU measures that are going in place are going to slash that an estimated 120 million per day, right? Starting January 5th, which was a couple days ago, but it'll take a while for these things to be realized. So we'll have to see. By the way, one of the big problems about economic stats, like a year later, you're not even sure what the GDP of a nation was, right? They get indicators of it. They try to measure it. They estimate GDP for last year, and then over time they update those estimates as they get more information. The various organizations that do the measuring of GDP, whether it be IMF or World Bank or whoever, or even national, central banks and that sort of thing. So we never really know, right? Until much later, then we figure out, right? So this is a big problem. It's not obvious, right? However, this is their estimate here from looking at various sources. And I think the important point is March through May of 2022, Russia was earning 1 billion euros a day, right? 1 billion. And now they're down to 640, and this will, dropping another 120 off of that will bring them down to 520, right? And so this is basically 52% of the original number, but basically half, right? So it looks like the revenue is going to be half of what it was in the summer, which was comparable to what it was before, right? So that's really not nothing. But is it enough to, change things? We'll see. Finally, they noticed, they say, look, Russia has made $3.1 billion shipping crude oil in vessels covered by the price cap. So they're looking at the effect of the price cap here. And they say, out of that, when they did that, they were still making $2 billion in tax income to the Russian government, really profits because the Russian government owns it. They're saying, look, they're still making money off of this shipping, this price cap. And so they argue, and the last point here, and this is their big policy recommendation, is, hey, your price cap's too high, right? You need to lower the price to $25 to $35, and that would slash Russian oil revenues by another 100 million euros per day. And this is their big recommendation, that, hey, at 25 to 35, they could still afford to do it, and they probably still would do it just to keep the production going and keep people employed. But you'll cut their revenue this way. And so they're arguing that, the bottom line here is, hey, price caps having an effect. Even though there are people who in the industry think it's ridiculous, their estimates is, no, it seems to be having an effect. It's just too high, right? Even, you're still too high. You need to lower it down closer to Russia's costs, right? So they aren't making a profit. So there's that. So that's an interesting set of conclusions and information from Korea there. Now, another little factoid that came out very recently is the IMF released its 2023 World Economic Outlook, where they say what they expect to happen next year. And so they look back at last year and give an estimate. And again, this is my point. Notice 2022 is an estimate. We don't know for sure yet what 2022 numbers actually were. And I've taken their graph and cut it up into slices here to just kind of put, everyone is listed in the original graphic here, but I've brought Russia out. Last year, IMF estimates they contracted about 2.2%. The Russian economy shrunk by 2.2%, right? That's an impact of sanctioning. But it's not always just about the sanctioning. There's a war going on. There's disruption occurring, right? And so that can also be in there. But they say that, the sanctions is part of it. And the disruption is people anticipating sanctioning, right? So, because it's markets, and people in markets anticipate bad things. And so you have, effects before the event. The point is, though, that Russia contracted 2.2%. 2.2%. Not the worst, right? There have been bigger contractions. COVID and Russia had a major crisis in 1990, 1991. But that's something. But here's the thing a lot of people are picking up on. The IMF, even with sanctions, looking at forward here and with what they think the sanctions would be, they still see Russia growing at 0.3%. Not a huge growth, but hey, look, all of, the comparable countries in Europe, emerging and developing Europe, 1.5% is, they're not predicting a lot of growth next year. And so that's interesting, right? We've got this 0.3. And so there's this idea is, hey, they're not in free fall. They may be stabilized. So through most of this presentation, I've been alluding to this debate over the impact of sanctions, because there is a question, right? Are they actually working? Are they doing, and this comes up. And so here are two recent articles on this that are more anecdotal, but that go to this question. And so the first one is by Vladimir Milov at Foreign Affairs, right? And you can see it at Foreign Affairs, even though there's sort of a paywall there, you can get through it to see at least this article. And Milov is arguing that the sanctions are working, right? And he makes a few points here. And one of them, the first one is, he says, look, people are getting these statistics, right? And he says the official government statistics are misleading. Now, he's not saying they're falsified. However, a lot of folks have been concerned that maybe the Russians are cooking their data, that Putin has in fact classified a lot of data. And usually, by the way, there's usually a lot of data available on Russia. Their bureaucratic traditions mean they measure everything. And so it's often the case that there's a lot of data to be had. But the kinds of things that are misleading, right, is, look, he says, look, the unemployment rate is, the statistic is 3.7%, which is not bad. But he says a lot of people are on unpaid leave, and that means they count as employed, but they're not really. And he says, look, his estimate is that actually about 10% of the population are actually out of work. The ruble, he says, yes, the ruble is doing okay, but it's propped up by currency controls. That, the government, in addition to spending its foreign reserves, has greatly limited the ability of people to take rubles to buy exchange, to move things in and out of the country. And that is having a big impact on ability to buy things even where you're allowed to, right? And he said that this has really weakened a lot of industries that depend on foreign inputs. And so he says, for instance, that he sees the steel industry as having contracted by 7% as a result of that. Then there's the GDP figures. He says, hey, look, sure, these GDPs, he cited a 2.7 decline in GDP. And he said, look, that's over, because they're now ramping up war production, those tanks and weapons they're building are coming out as part of GDP, but are they really helping the economy, right? A tank that is built and sent to, or refurbished and sent to Ukraine and then is blown up, that's the way he puts it. How does that add to the, economy? But it does count towards the stats. And finally, he says there's polling that shows a lot of Russians, only 23% consider their financial position to be good, and that 35% of Russians have reported cutting spending on food, right? So he said there are a lot of people out there who have had to cut their spending on an essential item. And so, this is his argument that, look, it's much worse than it looks, and we can't be thinking that the sanctions aren't working, because he says this debate leads to people pressuring to let Putin win, to negotiate and to give him stuff. And he says, no, we can't be deceived by this. We have to understand that these sanctions are in fact having an impact. Now, on the other side of things, we have Alexander Titov, who is a professor he actually works in Britain, or the UK, I should say, and he goes, because it's University of Belfast. Anyway, point is, he went, he took a trip back to Russia. He's visited a lot, and he went back, and his impressions, and this is highly anecdotal, but, he says, look, when I visit Russia, life seems normal, right? He said he went back to St. Petersburg. He's like, as far as I can tell, your first impression is not really much has changed. There's not a McDonald's anymore, but there's a new Russian version of it. And he said, you go into the stores, they seem to be well stocked, right? He said, now, if you look a little deeper, you do find there are shortages, auto parts, right? Very hard to come by. And that the travel restrictions are, in fact, being felt, that people can't move around in Europe like they used to. So he said there are impacts, but the first blush is you don't see much. Then you do see some problems. Talking to people, he said, look, businesses at first, they had a lot of trouble because their supply chains were disrupted, and we know about supply chain disruptions. But they've made new trade connections, mainly through Turkey and Kazakhstan. And as a result, they were able to readjust. And that's kind of that idea of that sometimes sanctions just disrupt an existing trade pattern, but the patterns rearrange, and they don't really cause a decrease in trade. They cause a diversion in it. And when the new patterns form, you don't have a cost, right? So it's only a short-term cost. And it looks like some of that was going on, right? According to his anecdotal discussions with people. And he said, talking to people, he says, look, attitudes here have been polarized by the war, but not changed. If you were pro-Putin, you're pro-war, maybe more so. If you were anti-Putin, you're anti-war and maybe more anti-Putin. And so that was his impression, talking to people, that no one's happy with the war, but people not being happy, or not no one, but he said most people are not happy with it, but that doesn't mean they don't want to continue it or that they're willing to give up on it, right? And so that's something he said, this perception gap. He said the Westerners are looking, and they're not traveling very much to Russia, and they're hearing about from Russian exiles. And he says we have we don't really understand what's actually going on with the attitudes in the country. He also just finds very little evidence of the society being mobilized for war, that there are impacts in it, but they're not all in. They're not, this is not something that is occupying their minds, and they're, aware of it, but the society itself is not all in any way here. And I think an important thing to come up in all of these things, there are comparisons in both of these folks, both of these guys, and other places to the 1990-1991 crisis and the COVID shutdowns. And where the Foreign Affairs article, Milov, is saying, unemployment today is actual unemployment is comparable to 1990, 1991. Titov is like, no, this is nothing like that. This is nothing like that crisis when the whole world was going to hell, from a Russian point of view, right? Just every day the ruble was worse and there didn't seem to be a bottom. And also, with the travel restrictions, they had travel, but they've had travel restrictions, right? They're not, and Titov says they weren't as bad as COVID. And so this is a point I think to make, is that Russia has had, there's they're familiar with this, right? They've had now it was a long time ago. 1990, 91 was 30 years ago. But it's still in their memory, and it's not nearly as bad. The COVID's there. So this thing is that they might be more normalized to this, and thus at the social level, not really being impacted. So anecdotal data for what it's worth. Finally, what's the bottom line here? And this is a very incomplete look because the data is incomplete. But at this point, especially in comparison to where we were a few months into this, right, in the summer, right, sanctions are having an economic impact on Russia, and we are seeing that, right? So there is an economic impact. The impact is probably worse than it appears, right? I'm going to go that far with Milov's argument, and Russian statistics on this, there's a lot of discussion that they are, if not cooking the books, they're definitely trying to make it look better and, classify things and keep a lid on things. Certainly the ruble, right? That is taking massive government efforts, and it looks like it's fine, but it's really not, right? That is probably the best argument or, evidence that what I just said is probably correct. So it's probably worse than it is. However, there's little to indicate that it's going to have a political effect or is likely to do so soon, right? We aren't seeing, this mobilization. We aren't necessarily seeing it weaken Russia. We aren't seeing it, spur a challenge to Putin's regime. We aren't necessarily seeing it causing Putin to lose face with lose his support with his elite supporters. In fact, this may be having the opposite effect. If there's less opportunity outside of the protected government, the government favored sectors and supported sectors, you would be more desperate to cling to Putin. And, if you can't take your money out of the country, there's a lot of things that might make you, more ride or die with Putin if you're one of his cronies. So I don't think we see a political effect, certainly not but it is having a material effect on the economy. And so the military effects may be the most important in the long run. It may preventing them from getting resources. And there's a lot of claims from the Treasury Department, but these things are always not, they're a little bit close hold, or I haven't been able to get access to data on it, but there are a lot of claims that they're starving them for the necessary parts, and that or making them more difficult to procure, more expensive to procure. Certainly the military mobilization is eating up the budget, and if you don't have as big an economy, that's going to hurt. And certainly the decrease in revenues from the energy industry is going to make it much harder to pay for the war, for reorganizing the military, as Putin is talking about doing in the long run. And so it may be that the military effects of these economic impacts are going to be more important than the political effects. That's where we are right now. Highly speculative, but like I say, we're guessing at a lot of this stuff, and we will probably look back on this later to have a clearer view. But as we go a year in, that's where I see us standing.